Hey everybody, it's Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week we have a question from Tara. Let's give it a listen. Hey everyone, if you're like most people I know, you don't have the time or the desire or training for that matter to sift through the hundreds of medical studies that are published each month. But whether you're struggling with a chronic health problem or just want to maintain your health and live as long as possible, it's important to stay informed about the latest research and how it might affect your well-being. And let's face it, it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the conflicting stories in the media. You need a source of unbiased information that you can rely on, one that's easy to understand without too much jargon and full of practical tips that you can put into action. That's where my website, chriskresser.com, comes in. You'll find in-depth, evidence-based articles on a wide range of health and nutrition topics each week. You'll also find over 10 free ebooks on subjects like effortless weight loss, healing your gut, thyroid disorders, and natural skincare, as well as online classes and programs on optimizing nutrition for fertility and pregnancy and lowering your cholesterol without drugs. What you won't find is any third-party advertising, corporate influence, or hype-driven, headline-grabbing stories with a lot of drama but no substance. You just get the real inside scoop on the health issues that matter to you most. So head over to chriskresser.com and check it out. And when you sign up for my email newsletter, you'll get instant access to my award-winning 63-page ebook, 9 Steps to Perfect Health. It's like an instruction manual for preventing and reversing disease and living a long and healthy life. Okay, now back to the show.
Hello, Chris. My name is Tara, and I've been following your work for several years now. Our family has pursued a functional medicine type lifestyle for the last couple of years, and we've overcome a great amount of health issues as well as escaped a toxic mold situation that was wrecking our health. I do have a question for you specifically regarding children. We've had our kids on mostly the same dietary plan as we've had for the last couple of years. We are all gluten-free, and most of the kids are also dairy-free, except for the few who tolerate it in small portions. With that being said, our kids are on the very small side. All of them, except for one, are under the first percentile for height, and they are very small in weight as well. I will say that my husband is Asian, and he is 5'3", and I am only 5'6", so we're not the largest people on the planet. With that said, I will say that they are also smaller than most all of their peers. I'm just curious if I should be doing anything different in regards to their nutritional needs on a daily basis as children. I know people often will tell me that they need milk or that they need grains or that they need all these things to help them with their growth, but I also know the downfalls of those different things. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are regarding children specifically and any additional nutritional needs that they may need. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for sending that question in, Tara. This is one of the most important topics for me as a father myself, and I just am so passionate about the health of future generations and making sure our kids are getting the nutrition they need and also just avoiding things in the environment that could worsen their health. It's a hugely important issue. I can't think of many topics in the whole health world that are more important than this. So thanks again for bringing this up. Before we talk more specifically about your question, Tara, I want to step back and discuss this issue a little bit more generally first. I think one of the most ridiculous aspects of the standard American diet and our overall approach to food in this country is this idea of kids' food being different than adult food. So, for example, you go out to a restaurant with a kid, one of the first things they're going to do is bring you a kids menu. And if you look at that kids menu, generally it's some combination of pizza, like cheese pizza, macaroni and cheese, or some other kind of super simple pasta dish with butter or maybe cheese on it, burgers and fries, grilled cheese sandwiches, this sort of thing. Then, of course, we have the mega industry that is kids' breakfast cereals like Trix and Cap'n Crunch, and I don't even know what they are anymore. I'm just thinking back to the ones that we had in my childhood, Super Sugar Crisp, cereals that are just absolutely full of sugar and other crap, totally processed and refined. And we've got a whole range of packaged lunch products like Lunchables and juice boxes and things that you squeeze out of a tube and a whole bunch of other processed and refined foods that we're supposed to give our kids and have them take to school. It's pretty typical now for families to prepare an entirely different meal for their kids, whether we're talking about breakfast or lunch or dinner, than what the adults in that family are eating. And I think that's a direct result of this food culture that we've developed in this country with this idea of kids' food being separate, which, by the way, is a notion that was predominantly created by big food to sell more stuff. I mean, if you don't have the notion of kids' food, then you're just feeding your kids the same kind of foods that you're eating, and you're going to end up spending a lot less money in all of these so-called kids' food products that we're led to believe that we should be giving our kids. So this is a big commercial opportunity for big food, and they spend a lot of money on marketing and advertising to make people think that somehow they're depriving their kids if they don't feed them this kind of food. So if we think about this from an evolutionary perspective, of course, it's absurd. There was no such thing as kids' food. There was just food in hunter-gatherer cultures, and even up until very recently in this country. So you don't have to go back to the Paleolithic era, and you don't even have to go back to the early agricultural period. You can just go back, in many cases, even just 50 years, certainly 100 years in this country, and you would find that kids were eating the same things that their parents were eating and their grandparents were eating. And when they sat down to have a meal at the table, they were all eating the same foods. Now, certainly very young kids, for example, without the kids that don't have teeth yet or that aren't able to chew certain foods, they may have needed some modifications, like meat being cut off the bone and cut into smaller chunks so that they're able to chew it well, but they can largely eat the same food as adults. And this is exactly what happened in our home. So we have a daughter, Sylvie, who's almost 6 years old, and she's eaten the same food that we've eaten from the beginning. So if we're having dinner and we have salmon and kale and sweet potatoes, that's what Sylvie has. If we're having breakfast and we have eggs and some greens and some bacon or plantains, that's what she has. If we go out to dinner, the only thing she does with the kids' menu is color on it with crayons, which I think is an appropriate use of the kids' menu. That's the only appropriate use of the kids' menu. We will almost always order for her off of the adult menu, and it's pretty fun to see the look on the waiter's face sometimes when we order, like a medium rare New York steak with broccoli and red potatoes for her. And then the look on their face when she finishes, a good part of it is always interesting as well. So, in general, I think we need to get away from this notion that there's separate kids' food from adult food. And that's one of the biggest problems overall with nutrition for children. Now, of course, that's not Tara's question. Tara, it sounds like they're feeding their child a paleo-friendly, gluten-free and mostly dairy-free diet, except for the kids that tolerate it in small portions, and that's fantastic. So, what I just said there doesn't apply to Tara particularly, but it's something that comes up a lot in discussions with parents and just, my observation about the food system overall and the role of nutrition for kids in that system. So I wanted to mention it. But getting back to Tara's question specifically, do kids need any special nutrients above and beyond what adults need? The answer to that is no, they need the same nutrients. However, it's even more important, arguably, that they get adequate amounts of those nutrients because those nutrients are so crucial to the developmental process overall. And we now know that there are really important windows for development that if the child is not adequately nourished during those windows, that could unfortunately lead to lifelong consequences. So I guess I would say the stakes are higher for making sure those nutrients are adequately represented in the diet. And, as you know, kids are still growing, they're still developing in so many different ways. And so those nutrients that we talk about as being important for adults are arguably even more important for kids. So let's talk about what some of those are. You've got fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, and K2 in particular, but also E. And the foods that will be richest in fat-soluble vitamins would be organ meats for vitamin A and K2, cold water fatty fish for vitamin D, cod liver oil is a great source of vitamin A and D. Fermented foods are a good source of vitamin K2. Dairy, particularly hard cheese, can be a good source of K2 if it's tolerated. Pasture-raised egg yolks can be a decent source of K2. Natto, the fermented Japanese soy product, is the highest source of K2, but I have to admit, I have a really hard time with natto. I don't like it myself. I wouldn't expect Sylvie, our daughter, to like it. If you can get your kid to eat natto, that's great, but there are other sources of K2 that are probably more reasonable for most kids. Choline and glycine, pasture-raised egg yolks are a fantastic source of choline and one of the best source. Organ meats as well. And then bone broth, of course, is a really great source of glycine. And glycine is really important to balance the effects of methionine, which is the amino acid that's found in muscle meats. So that's part of the issue in the U.S. and industrialized world in general now. We tend to eat a lot of muscle meats, which are high in methionine, but we don't eat as much of the fattier cuts of meat or the more, the collagen-dense cuts of meat, the gelatinous cuts like oxtail or brisket or shanks, which are really high in glycine. And traditionally, our ancestors ate from nose to tail, so they ate all the different parts. And what we now know is that it's this balance of glycine that you get from the more gelatinous cuts, and then the nutrients you get from eating the organ meats, like choline and all of the B vitamins and the fat-soluble vitamins, that balance the effects of methionine. If you eat too much methionine with not enough of the glycine and the other nutrients that are found in organ meats, then there is some evidence actually that suggests that could increase the risk of cancer. We know that once you already have cancer, there's benefit in restricting the intake of methionine and leucine. And so there's an argument to be made for not just eating very high amounts of methionine without also eating enough glycine and some of the fat-soluble vitamins, choline, and B vitamins that would be found in organ meats. Then we have iodine, that's an important nutrient, and that is found primarily in sea vegetables and dairy products if they're tolerated. So a good way to get sea vegetables into the diet would be things like adding some kombu into any soups or stews. It adds a really nice umami flavor, and it's very rich in iodine. Nori sheets that are made with olive oil, sea snacks. These are pretty popular with kids. Sylvie loves them. The downside is that nori is lower in iodine than just about any other sea vegetable, but it's still a pretty decent source, and they can be really good snacks. Another way to get the sea vegetables into the diet is to use kelp flakes in addition to sea salt as a seasoning or a salty flavor. So we might put kelp flakes on Sylvie's scrambled eggs, for example. That's a good way to get them into the diet. And then I mentioned dairy products are probably the highest source of iodine in most people's diet. And it's not because iodine is in the milk itself. It's actually, iodophor is a cleanser that's used to sterilize the tanks that hold the milk. So that cleanser, the iodine from that cleanser actually gets into the milk, and then that, we ingest it that way. So those are some options for iodine. Then, of course, we have EPA and particularly DHA, which has been shown to be a crucial nutrient for brain development, very, very important for kids. And cold water fatty fish and shellfish, preferably low mercury species, that's the best way to increase or get enough of those nutrients. We have zinc and iron and copper, a very wide range of benefits. And organ meats and shellfish are by far the most nutrient-dense sources for those particular nutrients. And certainly they are also found in a variety of other animal products and in copper and some other plant products. But it's important to know that with all three of those in particular, zinc, iron, and copper, the absorption of those nutrients from plant foods is much lower typically than the absorption from animal foods. So that doesn't mean the plant foods that contain them don't have a lot of other benefits and that you might not get some of those nutrients from the plant foods, but you're not going to absorb nearly as much as you would from shellfish or organ meats or muscle meats or other animal products. Then we have calcium, obviously important for skeletal development. If you're completely dairy-free, then one of the best options is consuming bone-in fish. So Vital Choice, which I've spoken about before, it's one of our favorite, vitalchoice.com. We order canned salmon with bones still in it. And there's also anchovies and sardines and other fish that still have the bones in, and they once they're canned, the bones get really soft. So you can just eat the fish with the bones, and that's a fantastic source of calcium. It's also a great way to get EPA and DHA and highly absorbable protein and selenium. So you're killing a number of birds with one stone with that. And then dark leafy greens can be a great source of calcium. And of course, dairy products are a fantastic source of calcium. And I've written and spoken about this a lot before. I believe that full-fat fermented dairy can be a healthy addition to the diet if the child tolerates it well. And that's the big question mark. But if there are no signs of any kind of reactions to dairy, no skin breakouts, no digestive issues, no sinus congestion, then full-fat and fermented dairy, the research has been overwhelmingly positive. It helps prevent cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, and a number of other conditions. And note that is not true for low-fat or non-fat dairy, because it appears that many of the beneficial compounds in dairy are found in the fat itself. So that can be a really useful addition to the diet if they tolerate it well. And then, of course, all of the phytonutrients that are present in fresh fruits and vegetables are very important. And the fiber that's present in those foods is really crucial to feeding the beneficial gut bacteria, which we know is one of the most important things we need to focus on for ourselves and our children. And then finally, making sure that kids are getting enough protein for the development of their muscles and tissues, enzymes, scaffolding. If you think of protein, it's kind of like the scaffolding of the body. It's what is necessary to build that scaffolding and all of those support systems. So if their diet is very rich in all of these various micronutrients and macronutrients, then I probably wouldn't worry, especially given your height and the height of your husband. However, if you are concerned, you might consider having some testing done for nutrient status to make sure that they are in the right ranges. And if you have access to a functional medicine provider, they could do some serum testing for nutrients. There's also some urine organic acid testing through labs like Geneva, for example, the ion profile or Nutrival that can be helpful in identifying deficiencies of certain nutrients. You also want to make sure that the kids are getting enough to eat overall and that their calorie intake is sufficient. Usually kids will eat according to their hunger. So if they're hungry, they'll let you know about it and you feed them, and it's relatively simple. But in some cases, if there are any issues, you didn't mention any health problems, Tara, but if there are any issues, for example, like SIBO or any gut issues, parasites, undiagnosed parasites, anything like that, those could potentially affect appetite, and perhaps the kids are not eating as much as they normally would otherwise, or because, depending on what their overall intake is of carbohydrate, sometimes what we've seen with adults is that when people go on a kind of unintentionally, they go on a kind of low carb paleo type of diet, their overall calorie intake drops as well. And if they're really active, they may not be getting enough carbohydrates to fuel their particular activity levels. So I think the idea that kids have to eat grains and dairy to be healthy is preposterous because, for the vast majority of human history, their kids and adults were not eating grains and dairy. And that was the natural human diet, didn't include those foods. But there is something to be said for getting enough food and calories overall. And so, things like sweet potatoes, plantains, yucca, taro, these starchy tubers can be really important for kids to make sure they're getting enough calories and enough glucose to fuel activity levels, especially if you're not including grains and dairy products and things like that. And if you're not including those foods in their diet, then I would do that because it's possible that if they're not really eating those carbohydrate sources, then they're not getting enough calories overall. So those are my thoughts. I hope that's helpful. It sounds like you guys are doing a great job with their diet, and I imagine that they're doing fine. But if you want to have a little bit of extra assurance, you could consider having some of that testing done to make sure their nutrient status is good overall. You could also do some calculations using something like MyFitnessPal or nutritiondata.com on what their overall calorie intake is, what your estimates are based on what you're feeding them, and then compare that with what the calorie intake should be for a kid of their age and of their height and weight, and that might be able to help give you an idea of where they are on that spectrum and if you may need to add some higher calorie foods to their diet. Last thing along those lines is I've talked about things like white rice in the past, and as many of you know, I think that white rice, which is just starch, can be a fine addition to the diet as long as it doesn't replace more nutrient-dense foods and as long as it's well tolerated. And that can be a way of increasing calorie intake as well, particularly carbohydrate if they're not getting a lot of that elsewhere. Okay, Tara, thanks again for your question, and thanks everybody again for listening. If you have a question, go to chriskresser.com/podcast question, and I'll talk to you soon.
That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresser L.A.C. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.